Sewing a full collar for uniform shirt. As we have marked and cut the fabric pieces for the collar and the standing collar, we will now see how to sew them together to make a full collar for the uniform shirt. At the end of the session, you will be able to sew a full collar for the uniform shirt. Let's first familiarize with the tools and materials required for sewing a full collar. They are collar and standing collar cutout fabric pieces, matching thread, measuring tape, tailor's chalk, small scissors, and sewing machine. Now let's see how to sew the collar for the uniform shirt. Take the two collar pieces and place them right sides facing each other. Sew along the two short edges and the long upper side with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now trim the seam allowance at the two corners towards the peak and turn the collar to its right side. To get neat corners out, gently push the excess fabric with the help of small scissors. Press the seam to the edge and flatten it. Then top stitch all around the three edges. Next, take two of the standing collar cut pieces and place them on top of one another, right side facing up. Place the stitched collar on top with the notches aligning in the center. Then place the third standing collar on top of the other standing collars, having the stitched collar in between. At the lower cut edge, fold the seam allowance of the topmost standing collar 1/4 inch over and press the fold. Then holding on to all those layers, bring them to the sewing machine and sew along the curved edge of the standing collar with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Make sure the collar is still in position by checking the center notches. Then sew along the other curved edge. Fold the two collars in half and compare the stitched shape of the collar stand. We might have to correct them. Now trim the seam allowance down about 1/8 inch along the curve and trim half the layers of the seam allowance down to 1/8 inch along the length of the collar. Now bring the collar stand downward and press the seam open and flatten it. Again compare the shape and position of the collar stand and collar. Then measure the width of the collar along the neck opening. We might have to shape the neck opening a little bit to ensure the fit of the collar. Next, place the corner of the collar stand with the double layer on top of the corner of the placket. The point where the inner collar stand is folded inward and the edge of the placket should be right above each other. Sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, starting with a reverse stitch. While sewing, align the edge of the collar and the edge of the neck opening to one another and make sure the center notch of the collar and the shirt come together. Sew until the other end of the collar stand and end with a reverse stitch. Then trim the corners of the seam allowance. Fold the inner collar stand over and place the folded edge right next to the previous seam. Now top stitch starting from the center back, but make sure that the inner collar stays straight down to the previous seam and is not shifted. When you reach the outer corner, turn around the corner and top stitch along the curved edge. Then along the long upper edge of the collar stand, down the curve again and along the lower edge of the inner collar until reaching the point where we have started. While sewing the folded edge of the inner corner, do not pull, but hold the fold down with a needle before sewing it down. Thus we have completed sewing of the full collar for the uniform shirt. In this session, we have learned how to make a full collar for the uniform shirt. Before we conclude, let's take a look at the key steps involved in sewing of the collar for the uniform shirt. They are: Step 1. Sew along the two short edges and the long upper side of the collar pieces with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Step 2. Trim the seam allowance at the two corners towards the peak and turn the collar to its right side. Step 3. Top stitch all around the three edges. Step 4. Take two of the standing collar cut pieces and place them on top of one another. Step 5. Place the stitched collar on top with the notches aligning in the center. Step 6. Place the third standing collar on top of the other standing collars, having the stitched collar in between. Step 7. Sew along the curved edge of the standing collar with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Step 8. Trim the seam allowance down about 1/8 inch along the curve. Step 9. Place the corner of the collar stand with a double layer on top of the corner of the placket. Step 10. Sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Step 11. Top stitch starting from the center back. Step 12. While sewing the outer corner, turn around the corner and top stitch along the curved edge, then along the long upper edge of the collar stand, down the curve again and along the lower edge of the inner collar until reaching the point where we started. With that, we have come to the end of this session.